All right, good evening. As was mentioned, we're going to be continuing on in our Hebrews study, and as you can see, we're going to be looking at chapter 3. And if I were to ask you the question, how are you feeling right now about the study? Where do you think your understanding lies with the book of Hebrews? Have you been able to follow along? Do you feel up to speed? What would you think if I told you that after tonight we'll be roughly 25% of the way through the book? How would that make you feel? And for me, I know I was a little bit behind. There were a few sermons that I missed as well. And also having little kids, it's hard to catch everything that's being presented. So, but hopefully tonight, what I want to do here in the beginning is give you a little bit of a recap, a little bit of a refresher of where we've been in the book. It's going to be a really high-level overview, but just want to help as we prepare our minds for these verses here, verses 7 through 19. We're talking about the end of chapter 3 here. So just a little bit of recap here. Who the author is. There's a lot of speculation, about who it was. Most likely it was Paul. I won't spend really any time discussing that other than to say, as far as what I see, my personal opinion, I think it was Paul. And so if you hear me say Paul, that's how I'm going to refer to the author. I'm not going to say the author of Hebrews. I'm going to say the Apostle Paul, or I'm going to say Paul. But there is some speculation of who the author was. The date written, ironically, it's easier to kind of pinpoint a little bit more of a date of when it was written than it is the author. They estimate it somewhere between 61 and 63 AD is when Hebrews was written. And to put it into context as well, the destruction of Jerusalem took place in AD 70. So we see that these events, or Hebrews is written prior to that time. The audience is, it's well believed that it's Jewish Christians that he's writing to, although it's not clear where this audience is. Some speculate that these are Jewish Christians in Rome, and that's kind of given as a little bit of clarity throughout the book. It might lead us to believe that they were in Rome. So there is speculation about that. We'll touch on that just a little bit later. But it is individuals who used to be of the Jewish faith who have recently converted to Christianity. And so keep that in mind as we reflect on this. Now that also leads us into the purpose behind the book. One of the driving factors behind Hebrews is to encourage the Jewish Christian readers to remain faithful to Jesus Christ rather than reverting to the old Jewish religion. So one thing I want us to keep in mind, and this is for my own context as well as we go through the book, but one thing to keep in mind is that Jewish Christians were somehow, some way, they were being tempted to give up Christ, to quit the church, and to return to Judaism. And that might be something that some of the other brothers have touched on already, but the exact reasons why, I'm not sure. It could be just the peer pressure of their fellow Jews who are still maintaining Judaism, and they're encouraging them to revert back. Give up this new way that you're thinking of. Why would you give up the way of your ancestors for this new way? And it could be as well, they're seeing how Christians are being persecuted at the time. There's a lot of things. Nero in AD 64, we looked at the dates. This was written somewhere between 61 and 63 AD. Nero, the emperor of Rome, the Roman Empire, he was very soon going to be starting to persecute Christians in 64 AD. And so there's a lot of pressures that could be pushing these Jewish Christians to give up their newfound religion and go back to the old ways. And so keep that in mind as we go through the book. All right, so looking at where we've been so far, for this, I won't steal the thunder of the guys who've gone before me. I'm just going to echo the thunder. How about that? But we're just going to briefly just touch on very high level what these verses talked about. Chapter 1 can kind of be broken down into a couple of sections. The verses 1 through 4 talk about Jesus as or God's supreme revelation delivered by Jesus Christ. And that deals with Jesus being superior to the messengers that came before him, who of course were the prophets. And God and the writer here, Paul, is saying that Jesus was the ultimate source of God's supreme revelation. And then we see in verses 5 through 14 that Jesus is exalted above the angels. And so here they're kind of being reminded, you're wanting to revert back to this old way, but remember what you're giving up. Remember who you're serving. Remember who Jesus is. And if you need that for context, I'm giving you a reminder here. And so he's fueling them. Paul is fueling the Hebrews with this knowledge, again, to remind them that Jesus is above the angels. And then chapter 2 starts off with a warning not to neglect the salvation. They followed all of the steps. They are members of the church. And he's telling them, don't neglect that salvation. And he talks about Jesus himself, how he was able to be that example and that sacrifice because he humbled himself and became human. He knew the challenges that they faced as human beings because he lived it himself. And of course, we know he was sinless. But having humbled himself, we then see that he brings salvation to mankind when he dies on the cross. So those are some very high-level overviews of those first 2 chapters to kind of give you some context, get us all up to speed with what we're looking at here. Then we get to chapter 3. And what Dylan talked to us about, not to sum up all of his great comments to just one statement, but for looking at verses 1 through 6, and we'll touch on this just in a little bit. But Jesus is more faithful and glorious than Moses. Now, if the audience is made up of Christians who used to be Jews, who's one of those key characters in their Old Testament history that they're going to remember? It's going to be Moses. There's going to be a few that, even as we as Americans think back to some of the best presidents, there's a few that you look back through in history that you can kind of get a majority vote. Abraham Lincoln, there's others that people generally agree that those were great men. And so when we think back to the Jews, just to use that as an example, but as we reflect on the Jews, who they respected among the greatest was Moses, even though he had his flaws. But we see in verses 1 through 6 that he reminds them that Jesus is more faithful and more glorious than this highly respected person, Moses. All right, so then that gets us to verses 7 through 19, where we see another warning. There's basically 5 main warnings. We saw one at the beginning of chapter 2. Here we see the second one, and this is to not repeat Israel's rebellion and disobedience. And so that's mainly what we're going to be talking about this evening. It's not going to take very long to run through this. So I guess I'll say listen closely, because if you blink, you'll miss it. But as we reflect on Hebrews chapter 3, verse 7, it starts off with the word therefore. And as we all very well know, this is very cliche, but it says whenever you see the word therefore, you need to figure out what it's there for. And so we mentioned it just briefly. Verses 1 through 6 is a comparison between Moses and Jesus. And so to draw a little bit of extra points from that, of course, Dylan did a great job of covering it, but just to mention a few things briefly. Moses, of course, was a faithful servant in God's house. He served God to the best of his abilities. At times he did falter, but here we see that Paul, in these first 6 verses, he doesn't talk about Paul's missteps. He doesn't mention anything negative about Paul, but instead he's contrasting the great attributes of Jesus compared to Moses. But we do see that Moses is a faithful servant in God's house. He's someone the Jews, again, they highly respect. But when we compare it to Jesus, Moses was a faithful servant in the house, but Jesus is the very builder of the house of God. And he's also the Son of God. And so just those 2 points alone paint Jesus as far more superior and glorious than Moses. And so now as we reflect on verse 6 as well, Christians are now members of God's house. He's reminding them that, you are members of this house we're talking about. But to remain a member, a Christian must remain faithful until the end. And so then we get to verse 7, where we figured out what the therefore is there for. Since Jesus is superior to Moses, let's now consider the topic of faithfulness as it relates to Moses' followers compared to Jesus' followers. So we see that he's starting to drill down. He's made this comparison between Moses and Jesus. Now let's compare the followers of Moses against the followers of Jesus. And of course, the followers of Jesus being the very ones he's writing to now. All right, so with this in mind, let's start our reading here in chapter 3, verses 7 through 11. Therefore, as the Holy Spirit says, and of course he's starting off here talking about the Holy Spirit, this is the authority through which these words came. Therefore, as the Holy Spirit says, today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion, in the day of trial in the wilderness, where your fathers tested me, tried me, and saw my works 40 years. Therefore I was angry with that generation and said, they always go astray in their heart, and they have not known my ways. So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Now, what's interesting, a couple of things about this passage. This is almost a direct quote, word for word, from Psalms 95. Ironically, it's the same verses as well, 7 through 11. Just coincidence there. But David in the Psalms is using this same story to reflect back on the children of Israel and their misstep. And in David's time, what was happening in his day was, or what happened to the Israelites back then is capable of happening during David's time. And so it's interesting as we reflect on kind of what's happening right now. I thought this was an interesting thought that here we are looking back to the Hebrew writer and what he was saying. The Hebrew writer was looking back to what David was saying, and David was looking back to this story of the Israelites. I just think it's interesting. That tells us a couple of things, that all Scripture is given by inspiration and is profitable for correction, for rebuke, for instruction in righteousness. And so when we think back to I'm so glad we went through the Old Testament study, because there's so much that can be gained and so many lessons learned. And also the second thing is we see that history repeats itself. Human nature is human nature, and if we're not careful, we're guilty of repeating the same mistakes of our forefathers. So I thought that interesting that he goes back and quotes David, who goes back and recollects on this story of ancient Israel. But as we look at these verses, he mentions a couple of things. The word today, which is going to appear later in these verses as well. Today implies immediate action is required. You know, I'm telling you this because it's important that you need to take action on it today. It's imperative that you do this and you do it immediately. And he also tells them, do not harden your hearts. He knows that what's going to happen if they abandon Christianity is they're going to go back to the Old Testament religion. If they give way to all that pressure that they're experiencing in their day, whatever it is, peer pressure or the persecution of the church, whatever it is, they're going to abandon it completely and go back to that security of the Old Testament way of worship. But what he says is, do not harden your hearts. That tells them they have the power to control the outcome. So he's telling them, don't be like Old Testament Israel. And we don't know exactly which situation David is referring to in Psalm 95. We don't know, Israel had a number of times when they provoked God. Here's just a couple of them. We can recall when they provoked God at Rephidim, when they complained for water. They were grumbling and complaining, just not able to be pleased. And then we also see they provoked God at Kadesh Barnea when the spies were sent out and the spies came back. They were trying to talk them into, hey, I think with God's help, we're going to be able to conquer the land and follow God's plan to take the promised land. But they rejected God's plan and they rejected Moses' leadership and his authority. And so it's unclear what David is referring to, but again, the point is that whatever happened then is capable of happening right now if we're not careful. So Israel was punished for their disobedience. They had to undergo God's wrath, his anger. He was greatly displeased. He was absolutely disgusted with what they had done, and he rejected them. And we see that even in that phrase there, it encompasses the very idea, they shall not enter my rest. And we know what happened there. That I believe it's all of those that were above the age of 20 they were just bound to wander through the wilderness, never able to enter the promised land until they just fell over dead in the wilderness. So why is the Hebrew writer referring back to this story of Israel's disobedience? Why exactly bring this example up? Well, he gives the answer to it in verses 12 through 15. There he says, beware, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. But exhort one another daily, while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. For we have become partakers of Christ, if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end. While it is said, today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, as in the rebellion. So he's essentially telling them, I'm telling you this example, and here's the reason why. Is because we need to make sure that we don't depart from the faith. And so this application of this Old Testament example, he's talking about all the things that will happen because of sin. Sin will deceive you, it will harden your heart, and it will lead you astray. And I want to read from Gareth Reese's commentary. I love the way that he puts this here, and it really brings it all together. But it says, Sin is deceptive. It promises more than it performs, and its dire effects are not usually seen at once. Sin is attractive on the outside and corrupt within. Appearing to be wise, it blinds men to the truth. Offering promises of gain, it leads inexorably to ruin. George Mark Eliot used to say, all of Satan's worms have hooks in them, and sin cuts the optic nerve of the soul. It seems likely in this context that the arguments presented to the minds of the Christians why it would be wise to abandon Christianity and go back to Judaism are what are called the deceitfulness of sin. The deceit is so plausible the mind becomes insensitive to the heinous nature of the act. By such an act you are falling away from the living God. And for further context, here in the footnote, he says the temporary advantages, in other words, the easing of their social pressures from other Jewish neighbors, those advantages may be made to seem of much more practical importance than the theological implications and the eternal consequences of such a move. One trick the devil uses is to get men to think that temporal and physical safety are more important than spiritual welfare. And so that's the deceit that can happen with sin. It can cloud our vision. I love what he says there. It can cut the optic nerve of the soul. It can so taint our vision that it makes us think that taking care of our physical nature is more important than focusing on the spiritual. And so Paul is warning them, don't be deceived by this sin. Don't be deceived by what people are saying around you. And don't harden your hearts. That's something that can take place over time if you're not careful. And he says he gives them not only what not to do, but he gives them what to do instead. In order to prevent this hardening of the heart, this gradual process of the deceitfulness of sin, he tells them to exhort one another. In other words, you need to encourage one another. You all are facing various issues, even from your own countrymen, your fellow Jews. They're telling you to revert back to the way of Moses. You all need to encourage one another. Take this opportunity to help one another along because there's even more challenges that they're going to go through. When should they do this? Well, he tells them, again, this word today, which shows up a couple of times in this passage. And what that means is they need to take immediate action on this. They need to start encouraging one another and building each other up in order to prevent this deceitfulness of sin from creeping in. And how often should they do it? It's a continual action. He says, do this daily. And so they need to constantly be building one another up and doing that right away. Concluding here in the chapter, verses 16 through 19, for who having heard rebelled? Indeed, was it not all who came out of Egypt led by Moses? Now with whom was he angry 40 years? Was it not those who sinned, whose corpses fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who did not obey? So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. And so a couple of conclusions here to draw is that, number one, these Hebrews were told not to repeat ancient Israel's failure. Don't make the same mistake that they did. Follow the direction of Jesus Christ. Follow God's commandments, and don't make that same mistake. And then also he equates here in verses 18 and 19 disobedience to unbelief. And I think that very interesting. Him referring to disobeying God as also as unbelief. And if we had the proper belief in God, we wouldn't disobey him. But it's due to that deceitfulness of sin and our vision getting clouded. It causes us to forget things that we once knew. It causes us to forget the promises of God and to forget how closely we need to be clinging to him and following his word. And so he equates these two things, disobedience and unbelief, together. A couple of other things that I'll mention here in closing. As we reflect on this comparison of Israel in the wilderness to these New Testament Christians, we see that they failed to obey God's commands, and thereby they were denied the promised land. I think it's also interesting, too, that this is a very good comparison to these Jews, because if you think about ancient Israel, them leaving Egypt, where they, the conditions weren't great, but as they got into the wilderness, had, a lack of food and water, you see them start to beg and say that, we had it actually better in Egypt than we did now. And so that is a similar mindset that's capable of happening now with these Jewish Christians. They're thinking back to the security they had under the old law. It wasn't perfect, but it at least seems better than what we're going through right now and this persecution we're going through right now. So I think it's a great comparison that he's making, going back to the Old Testament. But also, of course, these New Testament Christians, if they disobey God's commandments, they'll be denied entrance into heaven. And of course, the obvious application for us as Christians is to reflect on this Hebrew passage and realize the implications that it has for us. We can also be deceived by sin and be led astray and thereby be denied access into heaven. So that's where we're at in chapter 3. In chapter 4, it's going to continue this same line of thought and application for the Hebrew readers as well as for us as modern Christians as well. And so what's the key takeaway of Hebrews chapter 3? It's very difficult to take what Dylan said Sunday night and then take what I'm saying and sum it up into one statement. But if I had to, I would not do it. I'd quote Gareth Reese. So, but what Gareth Reese says is, since Jesus is greater than Moses, the rejection of Jesus involves more serious consequences than any rejection of Moses involved. And so as these people are trying to thinking about reverting back to the Old Testament, a person they respect is Moses. Remember how things were under Moses. People rejected him. They faced consequences. I'm telling you, Jesus is greater than Moses, and the consequences of disobeying his leadership are more severe than what the children of Israel faced under Moses. So hopefully that's beneficial for you. We never, of course, want to close the service without extending the invitation. So as we reflect on this passage, and I love this study of Hebrews, and I think as we reflect on some of these Old Testament examples that he uses, I think it's fitting, after having gone through the Old Testament study, that we reflect on, this book of Hebrews, and he's talking to Jewish Christians as well, so these are some of the Old Testament things that they'll remember. But the application for us as we face this invitation song is to realize that we're all capable of being deceived by sin as well. And if you find yourself in that camp, and if you've wandered away, been led astray, and need to make some wrong right, or if you want to become a Christian tonight, we encourage you to do that while we stand and while we sing.
Thanks for watching this video. I know what you're thinking. I don't want to miss another video from this channel. In order to avoid that, click on the red button down there, subscribe, and then click the bell icon. Not only will that alert you each time a new video is uploaded to the channel, it will also help spread the channel to other people's awareness. So, go ahead, do it. Like right now, click on it.